thanks very much for coming on a hot summer Friday morning. I didn't expect to see all the chairs full on such a day in the summer, especially since we sent out the invitations only a week ago. But I'm glad that there's such interest in this topic. And I'm very pleased to be able to bring to the stage two friends of long standing. I won't say they're old friends because none of us are old, we're just experienced. And we're going to talk about the nuclear ban treaty, the implications of it, talk a little bit about the process. We'll talk something about what it means for international security. I'm joined, as I say, by two friends and colleagues of long standing. On my left, Ed Ifft is an adjunct professor at the Center for Strategic Studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He's a retired member of the Senior Executive Service of the U.S. government and a newly retired again as a Foreign Affairs Officer at the State Department. And we were together at the State Department for many years. But Ed was mainly involved in arms control discussions and negotiations. He was on just about every delegation doing arms control negotiations over the past a few decades. SALT, TTBT, START, CTBT negotiations. He was the senior state representative to both the START and the CTBT negotiations, and he served as deputy U.S. negotiator to START. He served as the deputy director of the on-site inspection agency and senior advisor to the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and served as for 3 years as executive secretary of the USSR Space Cooperation Agreement. I'm sure there's an acronym for that one I could use. And he was a U.S. commissioner for the ABM Treaty for 2 years. So Ed is going to start off, but before he does that, introduce as well a friend from grad school. Natalie Goldring and I went to the Kennedy School of Government Master of Public Policy program. We're having one of our round year anniversaries. I'll let you guess which anniversary that's going to be. She's a senior fellow also at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown and an adjunct full professor in the Security Studies program in the School of Foreign Service. So Natalie's research focuses a lot on international security issues, including small arms and light weapons. She's one of the world's renowned experts on small arms and light weapons, also international trade in conventional arms and nuclear proliferation. She represents the acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy on issues relating to small arms. And she was at the nuclear ban treaty negotiations in New York earlier this summer, representing acronym. So when I saw she was there, I said, let's bring her here to talk to us about some of that experience. She was previously executive director of the Program on Global Security and Disarmament at the University of Maryland. And prior to that, she worked for many years with NGOs such as the British American Security Information Council BASIC, which is based in London, where she was the deputy director. So we're going to run for an hour here. Ed's going to start off, then Natalie will go. We'll have some discussion. This is all on the record, and it is being taped for broadcast after the event. So we'll keep that in mind and not make any incendiary remarks. But we want to keep it lively, so if we have a little debate, that's also okay. Ed, over to you, please, to start. No, I always want to be in the middle, but okay. Fine, okay.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and good morning, everybody. I was looking at my notes this morning, and I realized this is basically an hour lecture. So Natalie, if you have something more important that you'd like to do, don't feel obligated. All right, I will try to speed things up. We've agreed that this is a discussion, not a debate. And one way to speed things up, at least from my side, would be not to engage in this long-running debate of whether nuclear weapons are evil or they're essential and have kept the peace for 70 years. A sophisticated audience like this has been through that many times. You are probably split on the question of the ban treaty. I am also somewhat split because I have seen it from both sides. I was for 6 years a member of the National Board of Directors of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is one of the primary advocates of the treaty. And until the Trump administration forced me to retire a month ago. I was in the State Department, which is strongly opposed, of course. So I'm going to focus on the treaty itself. I might just mention that the details of where this treaty came from are all laid out in an article by Bill Potter in the latest Survival, which I assume you all have. The only problem with that article was it was written before the negotiations concluded, and there were some surprises at the end, which Natalie and I can maybe point out to you. Basically, there were 10 easy steps that led to this treaty. There were 3 conferences, one in Norway, one in Mexico, one in Austria. Then the banned treaty people went to the 2015 NPT RevCon, where they were very active. The RevCon failed to produce an agreed final document, although the draft had some very forward-leaning language about humanitarian consequences and so on. The US government was prepared to agree to that, but the whole thing failed because of the Middle East. After that, then the UN General Assembly authorized an open-ended working group, which then pushed the ball forward a bit, then back to the first committee, back to the UN General Assembly, and then they authorized the negotiations in New York, which has produced this treaty. I think the tactics were brilliant here. It's not too big a simplification to say that what happened was a group of non-nuclear weapon states and NGOs just kept passing the ball to themselves, sort of gaining momentum at every stage until they actually produced a treaty. Let me give you my bottom line, since we don't have very much time. I think it's a remarkable achievement to have produced this treaty with 140 countries participating in only 5 weeks. It may well be a game changer. As a political and a moral statement, I think it is quite powerful. But as a treaty, that is a legally binding agreement, I think it has some serious issues. The problem, in my view, was that it was done too quickly, and the nations with the most expertise and experience with nuclear weapons refused to participate. Originally, as I saw this developing from within the NGO community for several years, there were supposed to be 2 documents. There was supposed to be the ban treaty, which would be a short, maybe 2-page document that would be a legal, moral, and political statement, which would ban, delegitimize, and stigmatize nuclear weapons, but would not eliminate them. This would then be followed sometime later by a nuclear weapons convention that would actually eliminate nuclear weapons and would contain all the detailed elimination procedures and the verification arrangements for that. The process model was to be the Ottawa Treaty on landmines, which was negotiated completely outside the UN system, but showed that a coalition of the willing with some NGOs could produce a real treaty that had real positive results. The model for the substance was to be the Chemical Weapons Convention. Instead, what happened, and Natalie can correct me if I got this wrong, what happened in the last couple of weeks in the negotiation is that the negotiators decided to go for it in a single document. The attitude became, it's now or never. We may never get back to the Nuclear Weapons Convention. The Americans may find some diabolical way to block the whole process, and so we've got to do it all now. So they did that, but in the process, they left out all the key aspects of elimination and verification to be decided in the future at some unspecified time by some unspecified body, which is called a competent international authority. The initials, the acronym for that, of course, is CIA. I will resist the temptation to comment further on that. Earlier drafts had appeared to dump the verification primarily on the IAEA, but they have backed off somewhat from that. Now, let me just say, there's nothing wrong with a document that sets forth common goals with all the definitions and details to be worked out later. We've done that before. The That's called a framework agreement, not a treaty, and it's not legally binding. A British professor writing in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in the last week said, yes, there are these problems, but don't worry, it's just a framework agreement. He's the only other person other than myself who has called it a framework agreement. The trouble is, it says treaty. It is done. It's legally binding, and it can only be changed now with this very difficult amendment process. If I were defending this approach, I would say, yes, there are a lot of unanswered questions, but this will all be worked out in implementation, and the treaty provides for this. Yes, but countries, especially the nuclear weapon states, are being told, join now, and we will tell you later what it means and what you have to do to implement it. And by the way, this will be decided by a majority vote in some yet-to-be-determined body, the CIA. So you may not even agree with what they decide, but it's too late to back out because you're already legally bound. Unless I'm missing something, all these negotiations are among states' parties, not states' signatories. There's a huge difference. So people are already legally bound by the treaty, before they have this negotiation of what it is they're supposed to do. Let me read you a quote from one of the leading NGOs about the treaty, and it says, whatever is not explicitly prohibited in its provisions is implicitly prohibited through the spirit of this treaty. It outlaws all aspects of nuclear weapon activities from development to use and everything in between. As many states have said, the absence of explicit references to certain activities in no way implies that they are lawful. This ban is comprehensive. Wow, does that guy need to go back to law school? I mean, that just violates, all kinds of fundamental principles of international law. But it shows kind of the problem with the vagueness of the treaty. As you go to these various websites, they're all over the place. One says transfer of nuclear weapons is forbidden. It's not. That was in an earlier draft. It's gone from the final. Another one says that delivery vehicles are included, and so on and so on. What is needed, I think, is an authoritative negotiating record of the negotiations. That would be very helpful to have. One of the big problems is that there are no definitions in this treaty. Definitions are an extremely important part of the three big treaties that deal with getting rid of nuclear systems, INF, START, and New START. START treaty had 124 definitions, New START has 90, and so on. Let me give you 7 key terms in the ban treaty which are not defined. 1, nuclear weapon. A treaty whose basic premise, task, is to eliminate nuclear weapons has got to define what a nuclear weapon is. Is a dirty bomb a nuclear weapon? I don't think so, but I don't know. Nuclear weapon program. IISS will be happy to know the program has 2 M's in it. Looks better that way, I guess. What is a nuclear weapon program? Does that include delivery vehicles? Some people are saying it does. Other people are saying not. Can the U.S. keep its Trident submarines? We have converted 4 Trident boats to carry only conventionally armed cruise missiles. That was good enough for the Russians. Is it good enough for the ban treaty? I don't know. Can we have ICBMs with conventional warheads? I don't know. I sent an email 2 weeks ago to one of the leading people in this town on the ban treaty and asked him, does the treaty deal with delivery vehicles? No response. Nuclear weapons-related facility must be destroyed or converted. Does that mean that Livermore has to shut down the National Ignition Facility? Is that a nuclear weapons-related facility? Yes. Is that its primary purpose? No, I don't think so. But there's nothing about primary purpose in this treaty. Irreversible destruction. Pages and pages on what that means in the START treaty, nothing in the ban treaty. The word develop, you're not allowed to develop. We negotiated for years with the Russians over that word, and we were never able to reach a common understanding of what it means. Test. Testing of nuclear weapons is prohibited by the ban treaty. That word has a long history in the negotiations leading up to the comprehensive test ban. Comprehensive test ban does not ban testing, it bans nuclear explosions. And so what testing means is going to be difficult. Finally, nuclear material. Previous drafts said source and fissionable material, which is an IAEA term. Now it just says nuclear material. I have nuclear material in my smoke detector at home. I mean, what is nuclear material? So I can't emphasize enough the importance in a treaty that at least at the beginning, all the parties have got to have a common understanding of what the key words mean. Now, the other big question is, what about existing nuclear weapons? What happens to those? The treaty lays out two options, which we can call destroy and join or join and destroy. Those words aren't in the treaty, but it's a good way to understand. Destroy and join, which is, I think, encouraged by the treaty, would follow the South Africa precedent. As you know, South Africa had 6.5 nuclear weapons. They eliminated them unilaterally, then they invited the IAEA to come in. They were very transparent, they were very cooperative. Still took the IAEA years to confirm what South Africa had done. Remember the lesson of Iraq. Iraq unilaterally destroyed its WMD, but inspectors with far greater powers than they're going to have under this treaty were not able to confirm the elimination procedures that the Iraqis said they had done. You know the result of that. Suppose the Russians came in and said, okay, we've gotten rid of all our nuclear weapons. You can send in some inspectors to look around and confirm that. Would the US accept that? No, of course not. Would the Russians accept it if we did that? No. South Africa is not a precedent for countries with thousands of nuclear weapons. Okay, the opposite is join and destroy, in which case you can join the treaty and then negotiate the procedures with this CIA after you're in the treaty. I can't imagine 8 or 9 different elimination and verification regimes, which is what could result from this. Our assumption, or at least my assumption for years, has been that what we're going to do is work out and negotiate a set of elimination and verification procedures which apply to everybody. That was the whole point of the trilateral initiative. That was the whole point of the UK-Norway project. I was at a conference in California 2 weeks ago. A couple of you were there as well. There were good papers presented by the labs precisely looking at this, how to develop safe and effective elimination procedures which would apply to everybody. Finally, the title of this program was What Next for the treaty. I think I know what's going to happen. First of all, what is the relationship of this treaty to the NPT and the CTBT? The supporters say, and I think they're sincere, and we should accept that their goal is to support and reinforce the NPT and the CTBT. But this was an unpleasant surprise for me. States parties are not required to join either of those treaties or even to accept the additional protocol. So we're going to have 3 treaties existing together, the NPT, the CTBT, and the ban treaty, and you can add to that nuclear weapon-free zones. So there are 4 legal regimes sort of dealing with the same problem and sort of overlapping. I haven't thought this through. Seems to me there's going to be a problem there, but it would be useful if a respected international lawyer would do an analysis of that. The P5 are strongly opposed. They issued a joint statement in September 2016. The US, the Brits, and the French issued a statement the day this treaty came out. also opposing it. I think the nuclear weapon states will try to ignore the ban treaty. If they're pressed, they will say nothing has changed. Technically, they will be right. They will say all of the states parties are already prohibited from having nuclear weapons by the NPT, and most of them are already in nuclear weapon-free zones. But I think it would be a mistake for the nuclear weapon states to think that nothing has happened. I think something important has happened. You cannot continue to say and believe that the step-by-step process is fine and working well. It's not. In the same survival issue, there's an article by Brad Roberts, who was the principal author of the Obama nuclear posture review. He talks about that, and he talks about the Trump nuclear posture review. Not once does he mention the ban treaty. So he believes the ban treaty will have zero effect on the Trump administration. He may well be right, but I think that would be a mistake. The non-nuclear weapon states, and especially the NGOs, I think are ecstatic about what has happened. They're going to push hard to get the treaty more broadly accepted. Some of them are calling umbrella states weasel states. Some of them are calling nuclear weapon states that don't sign outlaw states. I will urge you as a final thought to be careful with language. I read on the European Leadership Network site, which I think is a very good site with authoritative people, the following, quote, "No country will have any longer a legal right to nuclear weapons," end quote.
These things have a habit of coming back over and over again in the UN context. It also makes it clear, and Ed referred briefly to this point, to the countries with nuclear weapons and the countries that have nuclear weapons on their territory, that this process as it's been can't continue indefinitely, that a majority of the countries of the world will not tolerate that. And that's an important conclusion. I do think it enhances other treaties. It does ban nuclear testing, and we don't have a CTBT. I wish we had a comprehensive test ban treaty. We don't. It has one of those problematic provisions, and it requires a particular number of individual states to sign on. And I wish we had it, but we don't. And this is a way of reinforcing the prohibition and the current lack of nuclear testing. It's not going to be neat and tidy. Ed referred to 4 sets of instruments. We already had 3 of them. So the question of coordinating among different instruments is one that's going to be with us in any case. I think that the question of the competent international authority is a significant weakness, turning over to that side of the ledger. I do think there are questions about how safeguards are going to be handled and how you deconflict this treaty with other treaties that already exist. As I've already mentioned, I'm really kind of unhappy, I'm unhappy with the nuclear power language. It was unnecessary, and that's one of the things that got put in pretty much at the last minute. But at the same time, some criticize this treaty as not having every implementation issue solved. It wasn't supposed to do that, and it's not a nuclear weapons convention in that sense. And there is an assumption that a lot of those arrangements will have to be worked out over time. I don't think South Africa is the only model, but South Africa is not a bad model for the states that have very few nuclear weapons. I don't think it's a great model for the United States or Russia, for example. There are other challenges. One of the main challenges is that the states with nuclear weapons were not in the room. That was their decision, and in fact, some of them have actually admitted they were actively trying to undermine this process. That's not a big surprise to me. This is not in their interest. Their interest is continue with business as usual. I believe this treaty is going to make that more difficult. There was a tension between seeking universality and seeking a strong instrument. And what you often see in this sort of negotiation is people making specific compromises in order to get sign-on from specific countries. And in some respects, the absence of the countries with nuclear weapons and the countries under the nuclear umbrella or nuclear umbrellas made that easier. because people weren't trying to make compromises to get particular countries on board. We saw this also with the Arms Trade Treaty, where it was clear from the outset that ratification in the United States was a non-starter with current composition of the U.S. Senate. It meant that people who would normally be fighting to weaken the treaty, to make it more acceptable, didn't have leverage. And so that, ironically, turned out to be a strong point of the negotiation. How was this possible in such a short time frame? As I said at the beginning, you had years of preparation and work that led to this point. And actually, many of the leaders of this effort were women. And actually, the person you wanted to send back to law school is Ray Atchison, who is not male and not a lawyer, but was one of the most prominent folks in putting this together. There was a willingness to forego defining some of the elements of this treaty and leave this for next steps. And the need to, the lack of the need to accommodate states with nuclear weapons was a plus. Okay. The last thing I'd like to talk about is some ways in which I think this demonstrated some of the potential of the United Nations. There's an inherent tension at the UN, as elsewhere, with the role of states and the role of individuals. And in this case, the non-governmental organizations were integrated into the process in a way that was nearly seamless. There were very few negotiating sessions among the larger group that happened without NGOs present. You had several NGOs represented on national delegations, but there wasn't as much of a push for that as there's been in some other fora, because we were in the room almost the entire time. And no, we weren't there for, the small group chats and negotiations that are often critically important and were taking place on the sidelines. But the expertise in the room was largely in the NGOs, much more so than it was in a lot of the governmental delegations. And people recognized that and they honored that. And so you didn't have the afternoon of NGO presentations sort of shunted off to the side that's often a feature of UN processes. This also wasn't framed as a consensus process, and that made it easier to get a stronger treaty. Much of the UN operates on a consensus rule that actually winds up defining consensus as essentially unanimity. If any one country is willing to put up its placard and say, I object, then whatever the measure is does not go forward. And there was an understanding early on that unanimity was not all that likely. And that led to a much more open process. And in the end, the Netherlands voted against the treaty, and they were the only vote against. Singapore abstained. And I think there's a useful precedent there, and I hope we're able to bring that to other issues. For the US government, that will not be a plus because it leaves the possibility that they get overruled. But frankly, if 190 countries are willing to go in one direction and the US is the only one that's outstanding, my sense is that that might be an indication that we weren't going in the right way to begin with. I am going to not go into detail on the unfavorable political climate in the US. I think that's a given. But I am going to say that what I believe you'll see in terms of what's next is a rapid move toward signing on September 20th, getting the 50 ratifications that are needed for the treaty to enter into force. I think there's a good chance of that happening within a year or so of the time that the treaty opens to signature. And so I do think it's a good move forward. I do think there are a lot of questions that we need to be answering along the way. I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Keep this for a minute for an equally clear, or maybe give it to Erica, equally expert and equally passionate perspective from your own area of expertise and advocacy. So we have now 20 minutes to engage in some discussions and questions. I have my usual lot of questions, but I know there are people in the room here who have background and expertise, and others who maybe have less background but equal interest in the topic. So catch my eye, and I'll call on you, state your name, affiliation, and wait for the microphone to come. So Pierce right here in the beginning, and then I see a couple of people after that. So, yeah, good.
Yeah, hi, I'm Pierre Skorton. I was also in New York at the negotiation, and I suspect maybe one of the few people in the room who were, because I was serving as an advisor to the delegation of the Holy See, the Vatican, which was given full participation rights along with the state of Palestine. I think Ed is correct in his assessment that this was a very much of a sped up operation, and the adage about if you want it bad, you get it bad comes into play. But it seems to me states are now looking at whether they're going to sign it, and if so, when. Some of the advocates didn't like it all that much. And on a couple of things, the IAEA was backed off because it was asked to back off. It's not playing a prominent role because it had to decide not to. The definitions issue, I think you can look back at the CWC as a precedent where there aren't so many definitions. To me, the biggest issue down the line is the question of latency and how you're going to verify against their state going back into the business or getting at the business of having nuclear weapons. And there's no definition yet about how the competent international authority or authorities will work in terms of their ability to override a state. They'll have to negotiate with a nuclear state in order to affect the verification arrangements to bring the treaty into force.
Thanks very much, Pierce. If you could pass the microphone maybe to the young lady in back of you, and thank you for that additional. We should have arranged ahead of time to let you come in. So if you have any reactions, hold them for now, and we'll get a couple other comments and questions. Yes, please.
Hi, Alicia Sanders with the Arms Control Association. Looking ahead to September 20th and the opening for signature, I was wondering if either of you envisioned that any states who voted for the treaty after consulting with their capitals will be unable to sign on to the treaty. An expert raised a question about the Marshall Islands, and I know that other states also expressed hesitations after the treaty, after they voted for the treaty. So I was wondering if you could identify those states and what problems they might have.
Write down that question, and let's get another one or two comments. Pass the microphone across the aisle to the yeah.
Hi, I'm Teraste from the Plowshares Fund. Thanks for the great presentations. I just had a small point about the terminology. I mean, the definition of nuclear weapons, for example, it's not even defined in the NPT. So isn't it a bit too much to expect that in the ban treaty?
Let's take one more question or comment. Laura Holgate, please.
Yeah, Laura Holgate, former U.S. Ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency and the CTBTO, both of which are implicated here. And my question is about venue. One of the things that hallmarked my, first of all, my shepherding of the Nuclear Security Summit process and then my time in Vienna was venue shopping by the disarmament community and the invasion of the disarmament issue into CTBTO operations and IAEA operations and dysfunctional ways. Those organizations do good things, even if the treaties are not fully, treaties that they are designed to implement are not fully in place. Many of the advocates of the ban treaty are very much beneficiaries of those activities. I saw a number of efforts relating, on one hand, to nuclear security issues, on the other hand, to even just normal, rational process, organizational process at the CTBTO, hampered and disrupted by the insertion of the disarmament debate in those venues. Now that there is a venue, can this conversation around disarmament move back into the CD, back into the first committee, back into whatever governing body will exist for this treaty, this new treaty, and let the agencies in Vienna do the jobs that they were designed to do, get those politics out of there.
Thanks very much. Okay, let's come back to the panel. If you could pass the microphone back to Natalie, so wait, Michael, if you could give that to her. So we have questions about whether states that said yes to New York, what if they don't want to sign it? Nuclear weapon definition, good point about NPT doesn't have that even. And the questions about the venue and then getting politics out of the organizations. If anybody also wants to comment on any of Pierce's elucidations, that's also okay. Natalie, do you want to maybe go first?
I'll actually fight with or argue with the contention that it's a bad treaty. I don't think it's a bad treaty. I think there's work that still needs to be done. But to say that simply because the states were able to reach a near consensus, near unanimity on this language in the space of 4 weeks of negotiations doesn't mean that it's a bad treaty. This is work that had been going on for years. So to describe it as a rushed process, I think just doesn't fit the facts on the ground. In terms of countries that voted for the treaty not signing, that wouldn't surprise me at all, simply from the perspective of what needs to happen internally for states to make the commitment to go through the ratification process. And I think that you have sort of levels of agreement. One is voting for the resolutions in the UN to begin with. That's pretty easy to do for a lot of states because it doesn't imply a lot of commitment on their part. Voting for the treaty itself is a level up from that. Signing the treaty is a level up from that. Actually ratifying or acceding to the treaty is a level up from that. And some of the domestic politics in these countries are shifting rapidly. And so I wouldn't predict that everybody will be on board. There's often some leakage, if you will, between what the votes are and what the signatures are. And then from there to ratification simply is a question of how long that process takes and how committed the government is to it and what other things they have on their plate that may or may not outrank that. I'm not in a position to talk about specific countries in that regard. I don't have that level of information. With respect to Laura's point, I don't think you get politics out of the IAEA, out of the CTBTO. It would be easier if we could. You can't take this back to the CD. That's a recipe for death. The CD has not been able to move on anything in, 2 decades at this point? So that wouldn't be a good idea. A fair amount of this can happen in the first committee, but a lot of it's going to be the states who do sign on and then do become states parties, developing the treaty infrastructure. And anybody who wants the politics out of IAEA or CTBTO should hope that that infrastructure is strong, that it's well supported in terms of staff, and that it gets stood up quickly. Because the more competent that is, the less pressure I think there will be on the other organizations. I do think you'll see some progress in terms of taking some of the pressure off of at least CTBTO, less so on the IAEA, because I think they're still going to be instrumentally involved in implementation of anything dealing with a nuclear weapons ban, whether it's explicitly or implicitly. That's where a lot of the expertise is on those issues as well.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Natalie. Ed, some comments from you.
Yes, on the question of law, I think several years ago, at least some of the NGOs were taking the position that if we can get this treaty done and a majority of the UN members approve it, that it will, and I had a person tell me this, it will become international law and everyone will have to abide by it. I mean, that is just wrong. I mean, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Article 34, says a treaty does not create rights or obligations for a third state without its consent. That's just common sense. It's also law. Then they backed off and said, well, okay, but it will become customary international law. No, that's not right either. And then, well, it will become the norm, or it will become a taboo. Maybe. I think that Natalie got it right when she said, and I think people are coming around to this view, that the effect, the hoped for effect, will be similar to what we got with the Landmines Treaty. whereby the US, Russia, other key states refused to participate, but they were either inspired or shamed, take your pick, into altering their policies on landmine. And it has had a positive effect on US landmine policy and so on. And I think the hope is that the ban treaty will have a similar outcome. The question of the spirit of the treaty, at the beginning of my 50-year career of negotiating and implementing treaties, which I hope is not over, I wrote a plenary statement in SALT I, way back there in Helsinki, in which I appealed to the spirit of the treaty, appealing to the Soviets to do something. A wise and experienced US negotiator took me aside and said, "You can't say that. There is no such thing as the spirit of the treaty. Either something is prohibited or it's not prohibited, period, end of discussion." That was a long time ago. I think he was right. In political speeches, people are going to talk about the spirit of the treaty, but if you're talking legal issues, there's no such thing. The IAEA, yes, I don't think anybody asked the IAEA whether they wanted to be the primary verification group. Maybe they did. One thing that I don't think people thought about was the Board of Governors has 35 members. At any given time, a majority of those are nuclear weapon states and their allies. So they could block or delay whatever it was that people wanted them to do. Did some people vote for this but won't sign it? Probably. I don't have any information on that. Some people voted for the negotiations and didn't show up. This is going to be interesting, particularly in NATO states, where you're going to see strong public support, maybe even support in parliaments, but that the administrative branch, who's worried about their NATO commitments, is going to resist that. I'm particularly thinking about the Netherlands and Norway. It's going to be very interesting. They have a problem. The NPT does not define a nuclear weapon. That's true. I don't think that's a strength of the NPT. And I think the lack of definitions was a problem in dealing with Iran, for example. The CTBT also doesn't define what is a nuclear explosion, which has also caused some problems. So yes, there are precedents for a number of the things which I've criticized in the ban treaty, but I just don't think that those apply or are useful. I guess those are the...
Can I just follow up on one on the IAEA point? Pierce mentioned that they took themselves out, but you said, well, they weren't advocating to be there. It's the kind of thing where if they were asked to do something, they would maybe do it. But somebody decided to take that IAEA out of the language. You said earlier it was in. You know the answer?
Well, it's still there in terms of dealing with, quote, nuclear materials, but it's sort of not there in the whole competent international authority.
And is that because of this, people realized that the Board of Governors was dominated by nuclear weapons? Pierce is saying yes.
Well, I think it was more...
Wait, we gotta get this on record if you're gonna say something. And then pass the record, pass the mic to Laura to also elaborate.
My understanding is that the Director General of the IAEA went to the Board of Governors to ask about the involvement of the IAEA in this exercise in New York. And subsequently, he wrote a letter to the president of the negotiation saying that the IAEA would not participate.
Oh, okay. Well.
So I don't know that it was ever said explicitly, but it seems reasonably clear that the board sort of said to Director General Amano, really, you ought not to hang around there, let alone participate actively. I mean, the IAEA has representation in New York. They could have easily had somebody there. If they did, I don't think I ever saw the person.
Pass the mic to Laura to add anything to this.
I'll just put a clarify that a little bit. What happened was the president of the negotiation went to the DG and asked, I'd really appreciate having IAEA as an observer, not a participant, but there to provide expertise and information about what the limits of the agency's expertise are, because there are absolutely some pieces of what the agency does that are absolutely apropos. There are whole other chunks that this treaty claims to engage with that the agency has no expertise, no authority, no mandate, no writ. And the DG said, this is a divisive issue here in Vienna. I am not interested in having the agency be part of that conversation, but in any case, it would require that I pulse the Board of Governors. And in order to do that, I will need a letter. And so after being told that they didn't really want a letter, they got a letter. He followed through, went to the Board of Governors, had a discussion. There was no vote. It was not a matter of a voting. It was in any other business issue, and there was massive disagreement for exactly the reasons that had been identified. And he returned to the president of the conference and said, this would be a divisive issue. I am not going to be able to send an observer.
Good. Okay. Well, we got deeper into that particular issue than I intended, but that's, there are 100 other issues we could get deep into. We've only got 5 minutes left to do that. Catch my eye if anybody else wants. You don't have to be as seeped in the detail as the last 4 questioners were to pose a question. Yes, please, right here, and then we'll go in the back. We'll get a couple questions here.
Hello, I'm Taylor Lane with the Congressional Research Service. I had 2 quick questions. First, looking at the Netherlands and the fact that they voted against it, do you think that takes away from the normative value of the treaty? And then my second question is, the treaty kind of comes out against nuclear deterrence as a national security strategy, and with the now 2 ICBM tests by North Korea, the United States is increasingly relying on nuclear deterrence as a part of our national security strategy. Do you think this could be a divisive issue for us and our allies or friendly nations who are also participating in the treaty negotiations?
Thanks, Taylor. Those are 2 good questions. Mark in the back. Pink shirt?
Yeah, hi, I'm Marc Goodman, State Department. I'm going to be careful what I say here. I want to ask a couple of questions, one about the nature and role of consensus, and the other about the role of NGOs and civil society. On consensus, I mean, the U.S. position has always been it's an essential basis for negotiating a treaty like this because states need to be confident that they can protect their core national security interests. Others see it as a problem. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that, with the note that another aspect of consensus is that the only way to get the key states involved in the discussion is to have a consensus of the key states. In this case, if you consider the key states to be the ones that have nuclear weapons, there is a consensus away from this treaty. So how does that affect things? On civil society, one of the frustrations that U.S. officials have is dealing with governments that are skin deep on these issues, and they rely heavily on civil society. And as Natalie noted, civil society was deeply involved in advising participants in this. But civil society doesn't have the responsibilities of government. So what are the trade-offs of having such a heavy dependence on civil society in this kind of process?
Yeah, I think the question is asked, who elected them? So I didn't mean to end on something divisive here, but let's come back. Ed, I'm going to have you go first. There are 4 questions raised. The normative implications of Netherlands saying no, and the implications on nuclear deterrence, given the threat of North Korea, the role of consensus and the problems there, and the role of NGOs. Any of those that you'd like to hit on?
Well, on the Netherlands, as I understand it, they were forced to participate by Parliament. A senior Dutch diplomat told me 2 years ago, we are going to go, but we're not going to sign. So that was no surprise to me, I think. I don't know what kind of a role they played in the negotiations. I assume it was constructive, but I wasn't there. On consensus, yes. That is a difficult question. I mean, it's always seemed to me, and this is not original, that why do you have to have consensus on non-substantive questions like rules of procedure, like work program, and so on? People should not be able to veto, things like that. I mean, one interesting tidbit here is that when the open-ended working group and the whole ban treaty negotiation was made by majority rule rather than consensus, a lot of speeches were made about how this is a big breakthrough. Finally, this process is going to be democratic. We're not going to let one or two countries frustrate the will of the majority. But what happened? I think Brazil basically kept the additional protocol out of the treaty. So, when the rubber met the road, in fact, one or two countries were allowed to frustrate what I assume was the will of the majority. And not saying that you must join the NPT and the CTBT, I think was probably also a couple of countries, and you can think who they were, forced that result. What else? I never came back to the question of, is this going to reinvigorate other fora? We do have the P5 process, which has sort of started down the road of trying to deal seriously with these questions. We do have the State Department's IPNDV process, which seems about to produce some results. Whether Trump will continue that or not, I don't know. The CD remains the logical place to do these things. As I understand it, we agreed some time ago to have a serious discussion of disarmament, but we linked it to fizz cutoff. So nothing has happened. Why don't we break that linkage? Why don't we just go ahead and have a serious discussion, not a negotiating mandate, but a real discussion of disarmament issues? Would it go anywhere? Maybe not, but at least it would open the channel.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah.
Somebody's signaling that we're timeout.
Oh, dear.
Turn that signal off. Give Natalie a chance.
Thanks. One quick correction, transfer is included. Transfer to any recipient whatsoever, nuclear weapons or any other nuclear explosive devices, or control over such weapons or explosive devices directly or indirectly.
No, not transfer, transit.
Oh, transit.
Transit.
I think you said transfer.
Transit, yeah.
Transit is not explicitly included. On the other hand,
Right.
what is included includes develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile, use or threaten to use, assist, encourage, or induce in any way anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party. And I think that says something about the way forward as well, which is that I believe that the nuclear umbrella states may be key to this, and that the gradual accretion of support there is a positive. We do see differences in terms of what the publics in a lot of these states are saying, and what their legislatures are saying, and what their executive branches are saying. And the Netherlands was, in fact, pushed to be there. They were not supportive throughout the negotiations. They raised issues. The only question was whether they would formally block consensus, which they ultimately did. So I don't think that has a significant effect on the normative value at all. It wasn't, as Ed said, wasn't a surprise. The veto in the structure of the UN was intended as something for the Security Council, not for the General Assembly. And this is a General Assembly process. So I think that's, there's a different question there. And in terms of North Korea, the most progress we've made with North Korea, I would argue, was, the agreed framework, and that held for 8 years. I don't think there are good answers there, whether we're talking about the ban treaty or whether we're talking about threats of deterrence. The threats don't seem to be working very well, folks, and the logical escalation of that is terrifying, and not just because I'm headed to Alaska on vacation with my family.
Thanks, Natalie. I think the question that Taylor asked was about whether this is divisive in addressing the North Korea issue. And I can see the point of that question. It's probably something we could address in a future time. We're running out of time. For me, it's I think we could agree that this the ban treaty, not a kind of treaty in the normal sense, but it did at least accomplish the goal of stigmatizing and delegitimizing, and a lot of disagreement with that, a lot of disagreement about the meanings and all the problems that Ed pointed out. But it certainly did create a new situation, and we have to realize that. And I thank you both for bringing clarity to that and to the other issues involved. Please join me in thanking our panelists.